Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Yellow Submarine from 1968. And this is the winner of my Patreon movie review raffle, chosen by StevoAwesome. If you would like to select a movie for the new movie review vote, since I can't do raffles anymore, then click on the link below and pledge to my Patreon, and maybe I will be reviewing your movie next month. The Yellow Submarine is kind of an interesting movie in that it's kind of perfect for at night getting high and going to see with your friends, and then in the morning seeing a matinee with the kiddies, and it works perfectly kind of for both, which is what's so awesome about it and what I used to like about it both as a kid and a teenager and throughout most of my life, because as surreal and odd as it is, it plays very well for everyone. It very much speaks to the accessibility of the Beatles, but also how surreal and strange they could be at the same time, and that wasn't like a counterintuitive thing. Those kind of went hand in hand. Particularly, I guess I'm talking about this period of the Beatles, but it's kind of magical how well it does that. The Beatles really made this to get out of their movie contract with United Artists. They had made A Hard Day's Night and Help, and Magical Mystery Tour was just a TV thing that didn't count. They decided to make an animated film, and since they already had an animated series running on Saturday mornings, I believe, which they didn't like, but they wanted to get out of the contract and figured this could be something different. And depending on which version of the behind the scenes you read, they added the live action part at the end to either fulfill their contractual agreement or because they actually saw a rough cut of Yellow Submarine, liked it so much, and then decided they wanted to put a live action segment at the end, even though they hadn't done any voices for the movie or really written anything. They just kind of gave them songs that had already been done and then a few other songs that weren't on albums or anything. This was the summer after Magical Mystery Tour, which came out late in 1967, and Sgt. Pepper's came out the summer of 67 as well, and it's like post Summer of Love, whatever the summer after the Summer of Love was, and before the White Album. So this is Beatles in their hippie prime, I guess, and they only took 11 months to make this film, which is kind of shocking considering how much animation and different kinds of animation are in this film. But the only thing about the contractual thing was that the Beatles actually did not get out of that contract. They had to make another film, and that was Let It Be. But Yellow Submarine has kind of had equal footing with A Hard Day's Night as being one of the bigger Beatle movies. I'm not actually sure which one did better than the other. I think both are fairly well regarded for different things but similar things at the same time. Both would be very influential and would set the stage for what would eventually become music videos if you watch Hard Day's Night and Yellow Submarine, and probably Help, but I haven't seen Help in so long and I never really liked it that much. Where they do these musical sequences where they kind of have these short films kind of within the film for their own songs, and if you watch a lot of music videos, they're influenced particularly by either Yellow Submarine or A Hard Day's Night. I know Hard Day's Night is often given more credit, and I would give Hard Day's Night a lot of credit for that, but I think Yellow Submarine had a hand in that as well. It's an interesting period to make this kind of film. It shows how big the Beatles were, because not many celebrities and famous people who are movie stars make animated movies starring themselves as a cartoon. That's fairly rare. Chaplin had shorts and things like that. To have a feature animated film starring the Beatles was pretty remarkable, and this is very different from the animated series. I'm not as familiar with it. I watched it as a kid. I watched a few clips before reviewing this, and it's very different. This is much more pop art inspired, which I don't know if the Beatles are really as pop art as this movie is necessarily, but it was going for the style at the time, and it was incredibly current and ended up being an animated film that everyone could see and everyone wanted to see. Adults saw this as much as children. I think what the Yellow Submarine ended up helping to do is get mainstream audiences and more adult audiences to see an animated film and maybe sort of respect it a little more because it was the Beatles. You're laying kind of the way also for things like Fritz the Cat and the numerous more adult animated films of the 1970s that would come after this, showing that there was an actual audience there for animation that wasn't just children. But also it kind of takes you on a really trippy, weird, strange trip through the late 60s Beatles catalog meshed with a fairy tale in this kind of weird late 60s animated trip. In Pepperland, which is a cheerful, music-loving paradise where everybody is happy and stuff, it is protected by Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band until one day the Blue Meanies come and drop apples on people and make them all black and white and stuff and take over Pepperland and put Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in a weird bubble thing everything. So then Lord Mayor, who's in charge of Pepperland, sends Old Fred, an aging sailor, to use the Yellow Submarine to get help. And then the Yellow Submarine goes to Liverpool, England, and finds the Beatles and goes back to Pepperland. And then the Beatles go through various different songs, eventually run into Jeremy, as they call him, the Nowhere Man, and pick him up, and then go to Pepperland with Old Fred, Jeremy, and the Beatles. And they go to defeat the Blue Meanies and hopefully bring cheer and happiness and music back to Pepperland. The look of Yellow Submarine is very unique, and its group of people is actually very unique. One of the things I like, and what I find really interesting about animation before we had a ton of studios, you'd kind of have these like one-off movies where you get this group of people to make an animated film, and they'd never make another one again, so there'd only be one animated film with those character designs and with that kind of animation. This film was very influenced by the pop art of Peter Max, and a lot of pop art going on at the time, like the Bob Dylan poster by Milton Glaser. It's very, 1968, that was the style that was going on at the time, and it gives it a very trippy, very odd, strange, surreal side to it. A lot of times people act like there'd never been a trippy cartoon before. I hate to break it to you, but there was this thing called the 1930s, and you should maybe check out some Fleischer Brothers. But I still really love the design of this, and the colors just pop in such a way, and it's so beautiful. A lot of that was because of the illustrator and designer Heinz Eldman, who used that style on books and various book covers after this, helped a lot out with the pop art style. This was, of course, mainly directed by George Dunning, with animation direction by Jack Stokes and Robert Balzer. It's semi-limited some of the time. Sometimes it can be very cartoony. Sometimes they can even have rotoscoping. The variety in animation is kind of surprising, and how they stayed within the character designs, with the exception of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Most of the rotoscoping, they kind of just don't give a shit, but the colors kind of fit in so well you really don't notice that you're really almost watching a different kind of a short film. And that was the idea, to go from short film to short film, to move from one thing to another and keep going through that. I like it for the most part. I don't really like the Northern song, one of the new songs to be released with Yellow Submarine, and I like the pop art sensibility to it. It's not horrible, but it just kind of distracts from it. They did cut out Hey Bulldog for American audiences, and I think for other audiences in the world, but I'm not sure. But in England you had Hey Bulldog, but everywhere else you didn't. And if it was me, I would have cut the Northern song, but I guess if you put that back in, no one would care as much, because that's like not as cool of a sequence. Which is interesting, because so many people wanted the English versions of Beatles records in America for a while, and then they released those. So it's funny, they actually had an English release version of an actual Beatles movie. I generally love all the songs in this. I actually got to see this in the 1999 re-release when they officially put Hey Bulldog back in the movie. I wish they had kind of a cut of the just American one on the DVD, but I think I have the DVD of the 99 re-release, so it's been re-released since then, so I don't know. This is an interesting departure for the Beatles, and I think one of the more interesting things that kind of sort of just worked out for them, because they didn't really have that much involvement with this film. I mean, obviously they wrote the songs, they had the part at the end, but all in all, it was like this English animation company, and they made it in 11 months, and they did it, and the Beatles were like, whoa, this is like real good. We didn't really think it was gonna be a good movie. That's kind of the interesting thing, is like they were so interesting and experimental. Most of the stuff that they were doing that with at this time, like Magical Mystery Tour, like, Apple Records in general, sort of didn't work out. And it's funny that the one that was the riskier and weirdest thing, animated Beatles movie, could have really not worked out, but did. And it's also interesting that the same people who worked on the Beatles animated series worked on this movie. It's so different from that. Because this film has such cross-generational appeal, most of the Beatles kids figured out their parents were in the Beatles, not from music or their parents telling them, which I guess they didn't. It's all confusing, but both George Harrison and John Lennon said their kids realized they were in the Beatles and what the Beatles were because of this movie. I remember liking it as a kid. I remember lots of kids really loving this movie and loving the songs in it. But then, when I got to be a rebellious teen and I liked the kind of trippiness of the late 60s, I could also really appreciate this. This is something I could watch being a 13-year-old, and I could watch with my 7-year-old brother, and we'd both have a great experience. That's something I love about the Beatles, is that you can sing it as a lullaby for a little baby, but then you can also, trip out to Revolution Number 9, and those are on the same record, and it doesn't feel like, you took these huge giant leaps. You might not like Revolution Number 9, but it all naturally works together. Not a lot of bands, I don't think any bands can really do that. And I also don't think a lot of bands could have naturally worked in an animated film the way the Beatles did. I don't think anyone's really tried. There's been bands who've had comic books like Kiss and like animated stuff, not too many, but none with a movie like this. And this really just set off kind of the pop art animation craze, which is more to do in advertising. There really aren't any other movies like this, which kind of makes me sad. It's so cool and visually stunning. And I remember in the VHS days, and because it actually was unreleased for about a decade or so, I think it was barely on video, but almost every video rental store I knew had it. Anytime we'd rent it, it would be so faded and so like murky, and the colors would run into one another. And then when I saw it re-released and restored, I was like, whoa, I can like see a lot of detail. It looks so beautiful. I saw it at the, of course, you know, where I see everything when I talk about a movie. I saw when I lived in Baltimore, I saw it at the Senator Theater, and it was amazing. And this guy came out and talked, who wrote a Yellow Submarine book, which is not that book. That's a different Beatles book. It was a cool screening, and I think, you know, we could take the whole family. It was very trippy and strange, and for everyone who's already seen 2001, the idea of making an animated film that, when animation was, you know, shorts were on the decline at this point. You had The Jungle Book, which was still a very good movie, which the Beatles actually turned down a part in, and you had big animated films, but you didn't have one that was kind of cross-generational in a way that appealed to the hippies and appealed to the generation gap in such a wide way. This was fairly well reviewed. It was a big hit and a very accessible movie at a time when that seemed very impossible at the beginning of New Hollywood and the changing of the guard that was really going on in movies in the late 60s. The Yellow Submarine kind of bursts out. It's interesting that it took this film a while to get rediscovered because of the Beatles anthology, and there were a bunch of screenings at film festivals, and finally MGM, who, this is like one of the few Beatles movies they still own. Lots of the rights lapsed and went to other companies like Miramax, and they thought this was a passé thing, but after the anthology, then they gave this a real good re-release in 99. I'm really glad they did, and they restored it, because it's a very beautiful animated film, and Yellow Submarine has a uniqueness to it, and a beautiful uniqueness to that pop art sense that Heinz Eidelman brought to it, that George Dunning brought to it. I wish George Dunning made another film. Apparently he was working on an animated film of The Tempest, which he didn't actually finish before he died, so that never came to pass. And I wish more of these guys had gotten to do another feature film, but I'm glad that the Beatles sort of let this happen, and it kind of just happened because of their organization, and just the design of it is so beautiful and colorful, and everything that's cool about the 60s and pop art and Peter Max and what he was doing at the time, and a blacklight poster mentality to it, but that accessibility. It feels of its time, but it also doesn't. You know, it feels very Beatles and fun and cartoony, and then it can still have very weird, trippy sequences. They made such a beautiful animated film. It's probably, if I'm being very honest, it's my favorite Beatles movie. I know a lot of people say Hard Day's Night, and Hard Day's Night's cool. I love Yellow Submarine. It's definitely the Beatles movie I've seen the most, and I have had various Beatles phases of my life where I'm just like absolutely obsessed with them, and this is a movie I could watch again and again and again, even if I'm not as into the Beatles at that certain time. Watching Yellow Submarine was such a treat, and I think it's such an amazing, interesting counterculture animated film. A lot of what it would do, I even saw in Belladonna of Sadness, a lot of what it would do would transcend and go into a lot of foreign animation, because I think it excited people. People were like, you can take pop art and take it into animation. And right at the time when animation was, UPA was coming in, things were more limited, but they weren't like highlighted in this kind of taking what was going on in the art world and bring it to animation. And also having this movie be about the biggest band in the world at the time, and the biggest band probably ever, the Beatles, didn't hurt either. And it just excited people, and excited people about animation and doing this style. Even though, you know, you could say it came from the art world, this is how it came to animation. There's a lot of reasons it shouldn't work, just the whole going from song to song to song and not having a strict plot to it. But going from like When I'm 64 to the Northern Song to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds to Nowhere Man to Sgt. Pepper's and Hey Bulldog, and having Eleanor Rigby in there for like no reason. There's so many memorable things about it, from the Yellow Submarine following Ringo in Liverpool, and they even managed to get the kind of quirky Marx Brothers quick wit that the Beatles had in A Hard Day's Night over to the dialogue in this film, and they actually had like people come in and like punch up the dialogue, make it more Liverpool, and it really works for it. And I love the like, you aren't bluish. There's just so much about this film I really love, and I think it's just a really fun, positive, amazing animated 60s trippy ass movie. As much as it's strange and weird and might feel like, you know, you can't really watch this without, you know, smoking 2 joints or something, and you can do that, absolutely, and you should if you want to. I'm not forcing it, but you can also watch this with a little kid and they will have an awesome experience as well. And there's not a lot of films that can play on those levels, and I think it's a film that really highlights what's so great about this period of the Beatles, because they could play on both those levels. They could be accessible, they could be counterculture, surreal, and mainstream, and appeal to everyone. And Yellow Submarine seems to find a way to translate how accessible and cross-generational the Beatles would actually be and probably will be throughout all time, and show how different people can take different things from that music, and it can apply to all those things but mean everything to almost anyone. That might sound like a broad thing that means nothing, and maybe you could think that, but I think the Yellow Submarine is one of those beautiful masterpieces of late 60s animation, and a wonderful animated film that it really doesn't matter how influential it was or what older audience it introduced to animation. It's just a beautiful, fun animated film with a lot of really good songs. So if you have seen Yellow Submarine and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And if you would like to pledge to my Patreon and maybe have your movie chosen for the new movie review vote, then click on the link below and pledge to my Patreon, and maybe I will be reviewing your movie next month. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.